A neighbor burns a black man's car, thinking it's just a simple act of hate. But what he doesn't know could destroy him. Watch how one reckless decision spirals into a life-changing revelation. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. James stood on the front porch of his new house, feeling the weight of the decision he had just made. The moving truck, now empty, rumbled away in the distance, leaving him alone with his thoughts in the unfamiliar quiet of this suburban neighborhood. It was a far cry from the noise and urgency of the city he had just left behind. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air of the house he'd just moved into, and the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty rooms as he took a final look around, imagining the life he hoped to build here. He had arrived to this town with a sense of hope, but also with a deep-seated wariness. The life he had left behind was one filled with complications and hidden dangers, things that couldn't be easily explained to people who had no understanding of what it meant to wear a badge for a living. The past had to stay behind, buried in the fog of cities and cases he could never discuss. The anonymity of this place, with its tree-lined streets and rows of freshly mown lawns, seemed like a haven, a clean slate. Yet, even as he unpacked his boxes, a part of him remained on alert. James had chosen this neighborhood because it was far enough from the chaos of his old life, but close enough to everything he needed. The house was modest, a 2-story brick structure with a small front yard. It wasn't much, but it was his. He could already imagine the future. Quiet mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch, evenings spent tending to the garden, and maybe, just maybe, a sense of belonging he hadn't known in years. The transition hadn't been easy. After leaving the bureau, James had cut all ties with his former colleagues and the world that had defined him for so long. His job in law enforcement had come with its own set of demands, not just on his time, but on his soul. And now, here he was, trying to rebuild himself from the ground up, knowing full well that a fresh start was a luxury that not everyone got. James moved around the house, surveying the rooms as if he were trying to imprint the feeling of the place onto his memory. It was strange to think that this would be home now. He was used to constant motion, to being on the move, to working in the shadows. But here, in this quiet town, he was supposed to blend in, to become just another neighbor. He didn't know how long it would take, but he was determined to try. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the street, James noticed his first set of neighbors. A couple was walking down the sidewalk, the woman pushing a stroller, the man carrying a bag of groceries. They waved at him and he returned the gesture, though it felt awkward. He had always found such gestures of friendliness to be foreign, something that didn't quite fit with the life he'd known. He wasn't sure whether they were being genuinely kind or simply polite out of habit, but either way, he needed to learn how to respond, to at least appear as if he were fitting into the role he had decided to play. Later, as he made his way to the mailbox, James noticed the man from next door, John, standing on his porch, a slight smile on his face as he watched James approach. John was tall, his appearance average in every sense, slightly disheveled hair, a worn t-shirt, and jeans that had clearly seen better days. There was nothing remarkable about him, nothing that immediately set off alarms in James's mind. He was just another neighbor. "Hey there," John said, his voice friendly but carrying an edge of something that James couldn't quite place. "You must be the new guy." "James, right?" "Yeah, that's me," James replied, giving him a nod. He tried to keep his voice neutral, his expression unreadable. "Good to meet you," John continued. You've got a nice place here. Quiet neighborhood. People here tend to keep to themselves, but everyone's friendly enough." James offered another nod, keeping his distance. "I'm just settling in," he said, trying to keep the conversation light. John's smile widened, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that James couldn't quite define. "Well, you've come to the right place. It's a nice little spot to put down roots, you know." He leaned against the porch railing as if settling in for a long chat. James couldn't shake the feeling that John was sizing him up, looking for something, maybe approval, maybe a reaction. The conversation felt like a test, though it was unclear what John was testing. For a moment, there was a lull in the conversation, and James took the opportunity to break the silence. "I'll be around, I'm sure," he said, nodding again before stepping back toward the house. "See you around then," John replied, his voice soft but still carrying that undercurrent of something unspoken. As James turned and walked back to his front door, he couldn't shake the unease that lingered after their brief exchange. The day ended, and the house began to feel more like home, though that sense of unease stayed with him. The next few days were filled with the routine of unpacking, organizing, and trying to adjust to the mundane but peaceful rhythm of suburban life. Yet, despite the quiet, something nagged at him, a feeling that he couldn't yet explain. It wasn't just the way John had looked at him, it was something more insidious, something buried beneath the surface of those friendly greetings and polite smiles. It was as though he was being watched, as if there was something in the air, something that didn't belong. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew that, like everything else in his life, this was only the beginning. He had moved to a new town, a new house, but the past had a way of following him, shadows that never quite disappeared. As he lay in bed that night, the sounds of the neighborhood outside his window quiet and distant, James reminded himself that he was here to start over. But, in the back of his mind, he knew that no matter how far he ran, the echoes of who he was, of what he had done, would always follow. The days following James's move into his new home passed by slowly, almost like a dream that refused to fully take shape. The rhythm of suburban life was predictable. Neighbors waved when they passed by, children played in the yards, and the sun rose and set without much incident. On the surface, it was the life James had imagined when he decided to leave his old world behind. Yet, beneath this calm exterior, something stirred, a tension that James couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. It was subtle at first, a glance here and there, the way people would shift uncomfortably when he made eye contact, the hushed tones of conversations that stopped when he entered the room. He tried to convince himself that it was just his own heightened awareness, that after years of working in an environment where scrutiny was second nature, he was overthinking things. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. John, his neighbor next door, was the first to make it clear that his discomfort was not entirely in his mind. At first, it was just little things, a slightly too long stare when they ran into each other on the street, a comment that seemed offhand, but carried an undercurrent of something more, something James couldn't quite place. The most obvious instance occurred one morning when James was out for a run, passing John's house. He'd grown accustomed to the casual, polite nods of his neighbors, but this time John had stepped out onto his porch, watching him with an intensity that made James slow his pace. "You really enjoy running, huh?" John had called out, leaning against the railing with a cigarette in hand. There was no real friendliness in his tone, only the cold observation of someone who was taking in every detail of the person before them. "I try to keep in shape," James replied, keeping his voice even. His instincts told him to brush past the encounter, to keep moving, but something in John's eyes stopped him. "Yeah," John said, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "I guess it's good to get out and get the blood flowing. You never know when you'll need to run from something." The comment was delivered with a strange grin, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. James felt his muscles tighten, a primal warning flaring up in his chest. There was something in the way John had said it, like a challenge or a threat veiled as casual conversation. But James said nothing, just nodded and turned away, increasing his pace as he disappeared down the block. He had been trained to read people, to sense when something was off, and his instincts were screaming at him now. The sense of unease that had followed him since he arrived in this neighborhood was turning into something much sharper. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that John had been watching him for more than just a passing curiosity. The interaction had been too deliberate, too laced with insinuation. As James turned the situation over in his mind, he couldn't help but wonder if it was more than just John's personality. Was there something deeper at play? He was a black man living in a predominantly white neighborhood after all. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. It wasn't the first time he had encountered subtle racism, but it was the first time in a long time that it felt so personal. In his previous life, he had dealt with it from a distance. Professional detachment had allowed him to rise above it, to focus on the bigger picture. But here, in this quiet suburban street, the animosity was different. It wasn't coming at him from strangers on the street or faceless bureaucrats in offices. It was coming from a neighbor, someone who could directly affect his day-to-day life. Over the next few days, James found himself becoming more and more aware of John's behavior. He would linger just a little too long when their paths crossed, would make pointed comments about his preferences when it came to home decor or lawn care, as if subtly questioning James's place in the neighborhood. Every encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth, like he had swallowed something too sharp, too bitter to digest. But he refused to give John the satisfaction of showing any reaction. He kept his responses polite, his tone calm, even when John pushed further. The next week, while James was mowing his front lawn, John sauntered over with a beer in hand, leaning casually against the fence. "Nice lawn you got there," John said, eyes flicking over the neat rows of grass. "Too bad not everyone around here takes care of their yard. Some people just don't care, you know? Wonder what kind of people those are." James stopped mowing and turned to face him. He kept his expression neutral, but his mind was working fast, dissecting every word, every pause in the conversation. John wasn't even pretending anymore. The veiled comments had turned into outright digs, subtle but unmistakable. "Some people have other priorities," James replied evenly, though it took everything in him to keep his voice steady. "But I like to take care of my place. It's a way to make it feel like home." John smirked, his gaze lingering just a little too long. "Yeah, well, I guess we all have our ways of making ourselves comfortable." He took a swig of his beer. "You know, I hear this neighborhood has a pretty tight-knit community. Everyone looks out for each other. Be a real shame if someone didn't feel welcome." James felt a chill run through him, but he held his ground. He didn't respond immediately, but he wasn't about to let John think he could intimidate him. "I'm sure I'll be fine," he said finally, his voice colder than it had been before. John didn't push it further, but the look he gave James was enough. It was a look that said he wasn't done, that this was just the beginning. The subtle tension between them was becoming unbearable, like a slow boil that James could feel creeping through the cracks of his daily life. James knew that John wasn't just testing him. This wasn't simply an issue of personality clashes or neighborly disagreements. There was something deeper, something James had yet to fully understand. John's passive-aggressive comments, the way he scrutinized James's every move, the way he tried to make James feel like an outsider, it was all deliberate. And for the first time since arriving, James wondered whether this was just the beginning of something far more insidious. That night, James went over the events in his mind, the encounters with John, the underlying tension, the way it all seemed to follow a familiar pattern. He had spent his career investigating people, reading between the lines, picking apart their behavior for signs of danger. And John, despite his seemingly benign exterior, was a problem. James could feel it in his gut, but for now he had no choice but to keep his distance. There was no need to escalate things, not yet. He wasn't in any immediate danger. But James knew that sooner or later he would have to confront the reality of living in this neighborhood. He wasn't sure how long he could keep pretending that everything was fine. As he lay in bed that night, the weight of the situation pressing down on him, he realized one thing. This suburban life wasn't going to be as simple as he had hoped. The quiet, the peace, it was all an illusion. And sooner or later he would have to face the demons that had followed him here. The question was, would he do it quietly, or would he stand his ground? Days turned into weeks, and the tension between James and John grew more palpable with each passing day. On the surface, life in the neighborhood continued as it always had. Children played in the yard, neighbors greeted each other with polite waves, and everything seemed ordinary. But James could feel the change, the undercurrent of hostility slowly rising with every subtle interaction he had with John. It was no longer just the occasional awkward comment or lingering stare. John's behavior had escalated, and James knew that the quiet war being waged against him was no longer a matter of coincidence. The first real sign of trouble came when James discovered his mailbox had been vandalized. It was early in the morning when he went out to check for mail, only to find the metal box twisted and dented, the door bent out of shape as if someone had hit it with a heavy object. The contents were strewn on the ground, letters and magazines scattered across the sidewalk like the remnants of something broken. There was no note, no sign of who had done it, but the damage was unmistakable. James took a deep breath, his mind already working to make sense of what had happened. He had been here long enough to know that the area was generally quiet, and property damage like this was uncommon. In fact, he had made an effort to stay below the radar to avoid confrontation, but someone was clearly sending a message. He didn't immediately call the police. Instead, he crouched down to gather the letters, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign, any clue that might point to the person responsible. There was nothing. No tire tracks, no footprints, just the scattered pieces of paper that now seemed to reflect the fractured nature of his peaceful existence here. The vandalism felt personal, like someone had been watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. John had to be behind it. James knew he was likely being paranoid. It could have been anyone after all, but the more he thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. John had always been the first to make a comment whenever their paths crossed. He had been lingering around the neighborhood, as if keeping track of James's every move. And now this, something so small but so symbolic. James was no fool. He knew exactly what this was. Still, he didn't act immediately. He couldn't. The situation was delicate, and if he made the wrong move, it would only escalate things further. He needed to be strategic. He needed to gather more evidence before he could make any decisions. In the following days, James became more observant, more cautious. He paid closer attention to the little things. The way John's eyes would dart toward him whenever they crossed paths, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the deliberate pauses in conversation when he spoke. There was always a tension in the air, something that felt off, but James had learned over the years to read the small, subtle signs that most people missed. And now, those signs were becoming impossible to ignore. One afternoon, while James was working in his backyard, he noticed John once again standing at the edge of his property, watching him with an expression that was difficult to interpret. James had learned to keep his interactions with John short, polite, but distant. He had made it clear, without saying it outright, that he wasn't interested in engaging in any more of John's games. But today, John's presence felt different. It wasn't just casual curiosity anymore. There was something deliberate in the way he stood there, hands resting on the fence, his gaze fixed on James like a predator eyeing its prey. "You ever think about how much people talk around here?" John called out from the other side of the yard, his voice carrying through the air. "I mean, not that people mean to, but everyone knows everyone's business, whether they want to or not." James didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure what to say. Instead, he focused on his task, pretending to ignore John's presence, pretending that this was just another routine afternoon. But John's words, innocuous as they seemed, sent a chill through him. "I've lived here long enough to know that some people like to keep their secrets, but secrets never stay hidden for long," John continued, his voice growing more taunting as if daring James to respond. James took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. This wasn't the first time John had made veiled remarks, but this felt different. It was no longer just about small talk or neighborly chatter. John was testing him, trying to see how far he could push. James forced himself to remain calm. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, John," he replied, his voice steady but firm. John didn't seem offended by the lack of response. Instead, he smiled, a slow, knowing grin that sent a shiver down James's spine. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm getting at." With that, John turned and walked back toward his house, his eyes lingering on James for just a moment longer before he disappeared inside. The conversation was cryptic, unsettling. It wasn't the first time John had made veiled references to James's secrets or to his being an outsider, but this time felt different. This time, James felt the weight of John's words pressing down on him. John knew something, or at least he thought he did, and James realized that this game wasn't going to end unless he did something to stop it. For the next few days, James took more precautions. He kept his interactions with John to an absolute minimum, and he made sure to keep his distance whenever possible. But the sense of tension only continued to grow. Every time he saw John's eyes lingering on him, or heard another one of his snide remarks, the weight of it became heavier. It was no longer just uncomfortable. It was suffocating. That night, after yet another tense encounter with John, James decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't just wait for things to escalate further. He needed to gather evidence, hard, irrefutable evidence that would force John to back off. And so, in the dead of night, when the neighborhood was quiet and everyone was tucked away in their homes, James began his plan. He wasn't going to confront John head-on, not yet, but he was going to make sure that the next time something happened, he would have the proof he needed to put an end to it. Step by step, James would gather the pieces of this puzzle. He had done it before in his work with the Bureau. He knew how to track behavior, how to watch and wait, and he would do the same now. But what James didn't realize was that John was already one step ahead, and the game they were playing had only just begun. The days blurred together for James as he continued to navigate the increasingly hostile atmosphere that John was creating in the neighborhood. His patience was wearing thin, but he kept his resolve. He knew better than anyone the dangers of acting too hastily, especially when it came to something as delicate as this. But with every day that passed, the pressure built and John's behavior grew more brazen. What had once been subtle hints and offhand remarks now had the weight of something more sinister. James had been gathering his evidence quietly, compiling a mental list of every small infraction and every disturbing comment. He had caught John in the act of lurking around his property a few times, just standing by the fence, staring at James's house with a knowing look in his eyes. It was unnerving, and it reminded James that John was no longer just a nuisance. He was a threat, someone who had moved beyond passive aggression to active intimidation. The last straw, however, came one evening when James found his car destroyed. It had been late when he got home from work, the sun just beginning to dip behind the horizon. The neighborhood was quiet, the air crisp and cool as he parked his car in the driveway. He didn't notice anything out of the ordinary at first, but as he stepped out of the vehicle, something caught his eye. There, on the windshield, were the unmistakable streaks of dark red paint splattered across the glass like a silent scream, a cruel joke. His heart skipped a beat. James quickly walked around to the back of the car and froze. Someone had slashed the tires. Not one, but all four. The damage was deliberate, methodical, and it left James standing there staring at the destruction. His breath caught in his throat. The anger, the frustration, the sense of helplessness, all of it rushed to the surface in a tidal wave. This was no longer a game. This was an attack. James stood there, his mind working furiously to connect the dots. This was John, without a doubt. It wasn't the first time he'd felt the weight of John's animosity, but this was different. This was personal. This was an act meant to push James over the edge, to force him into making a decision, whether he would cower or retaliate. John wanted him to snap, to give him a reason to escalate things further, but James wasn't about to let that happen. Without saying a word, James pulled out his phone and took several photos of the damage. His hands were steady, his eyes sharp. He had learned long ago how to maintain composure in the face of provocation. This was just another case to him, another puzzle to solve. He wasn't going to let his emotions cloud his judgment. But inside, a storm was brewing. He was no longer just the victim of John's petty harassment. Now, he was the target of something much darker, and he couldn't afford to let it continue. The next morning, James took the photos to the police station. He didn't reveal too much about his job or the work he did with the FBI. There was no need to draw attention to himself yet. He simply handed over the evidence and explained the situation, how his car had been vandalized, how his neighbor had been harassing him, how the tension between them had only grown since he had moved into the neighborhood. The officer on duty listened attentively, taking notes and asking a few standard questions. James was calm, his tone measured, and for a moment he wondered if anyone could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. The officer promised to investigate, but James knew better than to hold his breath. The police would likely treat this as a low-priority case. Without concrete proof of who was responsible, there was only so much they could do. He'd been in enough situations to know how the system worked, especially when the victim wasn't seen as important. As he left the station, the reality of the situation hit him. He had crossed a line. There was no going back now. John would know that James was no longer willing to let the harassment slide. He had made a formal report, and that would make things worse. But James didn't care. He was done playing nice. By the time he returned home, the tension had reached a boiling point. He knew that John had to be behind the attack, but he had no direct evidence linking him to the crime. There was no security footage, no witnesses, just the damage and the silence that hung in the air. As James walked back into his house, he saw John's silhouette through the window, standing by his fence once again. The man was always watching, always waiting. James could feel the weight of his stare even through the closed window. This time, James wasn't going to ignore it. He wasn't going to pretend that everything was fine. He opened the door and stepped outside, facing John directly. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, a palpable tension that neither man seemed willing to break. "You're the one, aren't you?" James said, his voice low but steady. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, but the calmness in his tone made John take a step back. It was the calm before the storm. John didn't speak at first. Instead, he looked James over, his eyes narrowing. The silent game of intimidation had gone on long enough, but John was unwilling to admit it. Finally, he spoke, his voice mocking. "What are you talking about?" James stepped closer, the anger he had been holding inside for so long finally bubbling to the surface. "Don't play dumb, John. I know it was you. You've been doing this for weeks. The comments, the little pranks, the constant harassment. You've been pushing me, trying to get a rise out of me. Well, congratulations, you've got one." John sneered, a look of superiority in his eyes. "You think I'm the one doing this? You've got it all wrong. Maybe you're just paranoid. Maybe you don't belong here. Ever think of that?" James's fists clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not paranoid, John. I'm just not afraid of you." The two men stood there, locked in a silent standoff, the air thick with hostility. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, but in that moment, James knew that it had all come down to this. The battle had shifted from passive-aggressive remarks to outright aggression. And no matter how much John tried to deny it, there was no mistaking it anymore. This was war. James's thoughts turned back to the photographs he had taken. He knew he needed more evidence, more proof to make sure John didn't slip through the cracks. But this time he wasn't going to wait for the law to act. This time he was going to take control of the situation himself. With that, James turned and walked back into his house, leaving John standing there, watching him, trying to assess what James's next move would be. The game had changed. The rules were different now. And as James shut the door behind him, he felt the weight of the decision settle into his chest. This wasn't just about living in a neighborhood anymore. It was about survival. The night after the confrontation with John, James couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the events, trying to decipher the exact moment when things had shifted. There was no denying it now. This wasn't just petty harassment or an unfortunate series of misunderstandings. John had made it clear that he was no longer just an annoying neighbor. He was a threat, and James needed to do something about it. James had spent years working in law enforcement, honing the skills necessary to read situations and people, to understand motives, and to use that knowledge to his advantage. But now, for the first time, he was in a situation where his training wasn't enough. There were no guidelines for this kind of personal battle. There was no manual on how to deal with a neighbor who was determined to destroy your peace of mind, someone who would go so far as to damage your property, slander your name, and instigate public humiliation, all because of the color of your skin. He had always thought that leaving his previous life behind and starting fresh would give him the chance to rebuild, to escape the shadows of his past. But now, as he lay in his bed, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, he realized how naive he had been. He had underestimated the depth of the hatred that still lingered just beneath the surface of the world around him. John's racism wasn't just a personal flaw. It was part of a larger, deeper sickness that festered in the quiet corners of society. James was now its target, and no amount of distance, no new home, no change of scenery would protect him. He needed to think clearly, and he needed to act fast. The next morning, he made his decision. He would no longer wait for the authorities to take action. The police were unlikely to prioritize his case. He had already learned the hard way that when it came to incidents like this, especially those involving racial animus, justice could be a slow and broken process. If he wanted to put an end to this once and for all, he would have to take matters into his own hands. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed help, and he knew exactly where to turn. James had kept his job with the FBI a secret from his neighbors. It wasn't that he was ashamed of his work, far from it, but revealing his true identity would only complicate matters. His colleagues at the Bureau had always been supportive, but none of them knew about his decision to relocate to a quiet suburb. He had hoped to leave his previous life behind and live a more peaceful existence. But now, the very skills that had once made him invaluable in investigations would be the ones that would help him out of this nightmare. He sat at his kitchen table, his phone in hand, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. He hesitated for a moment, then pressed call. The phone rang twice before it was picked up. "James, what's going on?" It was Robert, a close colleague at the Bureau who had always been more than just a professional connection. Robert had been a mentor to him early on, and over the years they had forged a bond of trust that went beyond work. James had always known that he could count on Robert no matter the situation. "I need help," James said, his voice low but urgent. "I'm dealing with a situation here, something personal. I need to investigate a neighbor. His name's John. I believe he's been targeting me, and I need to gather evidence against him. I can't go through the proper channels without revealing too much, so I need you to help me gather information discreetly." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Robert, ever the professional, didn't question James's request, but James could hear the concern in his voice. "Are you sure about this?" Robert asked, his tone cautious. "This sounds risky. You're not exactly in a position to be drawing attention to yourself." "I know," James replied, "but I can't afford to wait anymore. He's escalating, and I need to stop him before it goes any further." Another long pause followed, but then Robert spoke again, his voice firm. "All right, I'll get on it. We'll do this by the book, as quietly as possible. I'll have some people look into his background and see what we can find. Stay put, and don't do anything rash." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. He trusted Robert completely. The investigation would begin immediately, and soon they would have the evidence they needed to put an end to John's reign of terror. But as the call ended and James sat back in his chair, the weight of what he had just set into motion pressed down on him. It wasn't just a matter of finding out who John really was anymore. It was about survival. He had already lost too much: his peace of mind, his sense of safety, his ability to trust the people around him. And now he wasn't willing to lose any more. For the next few days, James kept a low profile. He spent his time quietly observing John's behavior, noting the subtle changes, the way John seemed to linger just a little longer than usual when passing by, the small, insidious gestures that were impossible to ignore. Every time James caught John looking at him with those cold, calculating eyes, his resolve hardened. It was clear that John wasn't going to stop on his own. This was going to take more than just patience and restraint. And it wasn't just John who was making James's life difficult. The other neighbors, who had once seemed so friendly, were beginning to show their true colors as well. In the past, James had always made an effort to fit in, to be the good neighbor, to wave and say hello, to participate in the small, mundane rituals of suburban life. But now, he couldn't help but feel the eyes on him everywhere he went. The subtle glances, the whispered conversations behind closed doors. It was like a veil had been lifted, and he could see the quiet disdain that had always simmered beneath the surface. John's behavior had infected the entire neighborhood. The quiet whispers, the sideways glances, the half-hearted smiles. All of it was part of the same twisted game. James had known that there would be challenges, that starting fresh wouldn't mean starting completely over. But he hadn't anticipated the depth of the animosity that still lingered in places like this. Places where people liked to believe that they were beyond the racial divisions of the past. It was in that realization, as he stared out the window one evening, watching John work on his lawn across the street, that something inside James clicked. It wasn't just about John anymore. It was about everything. The pervasive, insidious nature of racism, how it could worm its way into the most mundane aspects of life, and how it could thrive in places that seemed the least likely to harbor it. But, as much as James wanted to let his anger fuel him, he knew that he couldn't. He had a plan now, and he couldn't afford to let it be derailed by his emotions. He had to stay focused. The investigation was already underway. Soon they would uncover John's secrets, his weaknesses. But the real question was, how far was James willing to go to bring justice to someone who was so deeply entrenched in their own hatred? It had been nearly a week since James had reached out to Robert for help, and though the days had dragged on with tension hanging over him like a storm cloud, there was a growing sense of urgency in the air. The investigation was making progress. Robert and his team had dug deep into John's background, carefully piecing together a picture of the man who had so consistently made James's life a living nightmare. The details were starting to come together, but James knew it wasn't enough yet. They needed more. Each day, James remained on edge, but he kept his cool, knowing that every moment brought them closer to the truth. His every move was calculated, his interactions with the other neighbors cautiously measured. He had learned to read them, to understand the subtle cues that betrayed their attitudes. Even in the moments when no one was directly hostile, he could feel the weight of their judgment. It was like walking through a fog of unspoken tension, and each time he encountered someone who seemed to look past him or avoid his gaze, the feeling of isolation deepened. John, for his part, seemed to be biding his time, perhaps sensing that something was changing. His usual petty provocations had ceased, though James wasn't fooled. It felt more like the calm before the storm. John was too entrenched in his hate to simply back off. James knew better than to think this would end quietly. By the end of the week, Robert called again. James had been waiting for this call, for the information that would provide him with the ammunition he needed to put an end to this once and for all. He stepped outside, walking to the corner of his driveway where he could speak in private. His pulse quickened as the phone rang. "James," Robert's voice came through, low and purposeful. "We've got everything. I've got the full dossier on John. You were right to ask for help. His entire history is a tangled web of resentment and small-time crime. It looks like he's been trying to hide his past. A few minor run-ins with the law, but nothing that would ever get him arrested. He's been living here for years, quietly simmering in his own animosity, probably thinking the rest of the world has forgotten about him, but we've got enough to make sure his life doesn't stay the same for much longer." James felt a flicker of satisfaction at Robert's words, but it was fleeting. This wasn't a victory yet. There was still much work to be done. "What's the next step?" James asked, his voice steady, though the weight of what they were about to do loomed over him. "Next," Robert said, "we need to confront him. You can't let him know that we've been gathering intel, but you can't sit back and wait for him to make his next move. You're right to feel like he's just waiting for the right moment to escalate things. We've got a window here, but it's closing fast." James's mind raced. He was used to operating in the shadows, gathering intel and piecing together evidence. But now, this wasn't just about collecting facts, it was about taking action. He had to be strategic. The last thing he wanted was for John to slip through the cracks, or worse, to escalate in ways that put James's life and his career at risk. "I'll deal with it," James said, the weight of responsibility settling on him. "But I'm not taking any chances. This ends now." With that, James made a plan. He would confront John, but not in the way John might expect. He wasn't going to threaten or escalate things. He would do what he did best: work quietly, methodically, and with precision. He would use John's own mistakes to bring him down. That night, after the sun had set and the neighborhood had quieted down, James waited in his living room watching the window where John's house stood just across the street. The street lamps flickered on, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns. It was the perfect setting for what was about to unfold. James's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Robert. "It's time," Robert's message read. "The rest is up to you." James closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He wasn't scared, but there was a cold determination in him now. The time for patience and quiet observation had passed. John had shown him that he wouldn't back down until forced to do so, and James was done playing by the rules of the game John had set. He slipped into his coat and walked outside, moving with purpose, though his mind raced with each step. He couldn't afford to make a misstep now. His investigation had uncovered a series of increasingly troubling facts about John: small crimes, a history of harassment, and a deep-seated fear of being overshadowed. John had a history of racism, but it ran deeper than that. He was a man haunted by his own failures, resentful of anyone who seemed to challenge his sense of control, and deeply insecure about his place in the world. James had already put everything into motion. His next step was to ensure that John's destructive behavior didn't continue unchecked. He walked across the street toward John's house, feeling the weight of the moment settle on him. He didn't hesitate as he knocked on the door. The sound echoed in the silence of the neighborhood. A moment passed before John answered, his expression guarded but curious. His eyes flickered with recognition, but he didn't speak immediately. There was something about the way he stood, just inside the doorway, as though expecting James to leave. "You need to listen," James said calmly, keeping his tone even but firm. "I know what you've been doing. I know what you're capable of, and I know your past." John's expression shifted. He had a brief moment of hesitation before the mask of indifference slipped back into place. "You don't know anything about me," John muttered, his voice cold. "I know enough," James replied, "and you know exactly what I'm talking about. The lies, the intimidation, the way you've been making my life a living hell. But the thing is, it's over now. I've got the evidence, and I'm not going to let you get away with it anymore." John's eyes darted, his defensive posture giving way to something closer to panic. "What do you want from me?" he spat. James didn't flinch. He had the upper hand now, and he wasn't about to let it slip. "I want you to leave me and everyone else in this neighborhood alone. I want you to stay out of my life, or I'll make sure that everything you've done comes to light. The things you thought you could bury, they're going to surface. You won't be able to hide anymore." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the threat of unspoken consequences. Then John's expression hardened, his mouth twisted into a sneer. "You think you can scare me? You think I'm just going to back down?" James's eyes locked onto his neighbor's, unwavering. "You don't have a choice." John slammed the door in James's face, but as he turned to walk away, James felt a strange sense of resolution settle over him. He had done it. He had confronted his tormentor and laid the groundwork for the end of the harassment. But the final step was still ahead, making sure that John's world collapsed in on him, that the man who had thought he could control everyone around him would finally face the consequences of his actions. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. And James had just delivered the first blow. The following days unfolded with a heavy silence. James didn't expect an immediate response from John after their confrontation. His words had been sharp, deliberate, and he knew they had struck a nerve. John wasn't the type to back down easily, but the threat had been real, and James had planted the seeds of doubt in his mind. For now, it seemed like a game of waiting. James had done his part, and now it was time to let the law and his investigation take its course. But as the days passed, James found himself increasingly uneasy. John's silence was more unsettling than he had anticipated. It wasn't the kind of silence that meant retreat. It felt like the calm before an explosion. John had something in mind. James could feel it. He was ready for whatever would come next, but deep down he knew he couldn't allow this to drag on forever. The stakes had risen too high. He had already done the hard work, and now it was time to see it through. He wasn't about to let John continue his harassment, his game of power and control, for another day. The phone call came early one morning. Robert's voice, urgent and tight with emotion, broke the stillness of James's thoughts. "James, we've got a problem," Robert said. "We've been monitoring John's movements and we found something. He's planning something big. This isn't just petty harassment anymore. He's made threats against you, and he's got a plan. We don't know exactly what it is, but it's not good." James's heart raced as he processed the words. He had been right all along. This wasn't over. John hadn't simply taken a step back. He was preparing for something worse. "Do we have enough to move forward?" James asked, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "We have enough to arrest him, but we need to act fast. If we don't, he could do something irreversible." The next few hours passed in a blur. Robert's team had managed to track John's activities and identify his possible next steps. James was torn between the need to act quickly and the desire to be cautious, to ensure that everything was handled the right way. His instinct told him that this was the moment where things would either end in disaster or resolution. James knew that confronting John directly again would be too dangerous. This time he would have to rely on the law, on the proof he had gathered and the investigation that was now in full swing. He would have to trust Robert and his colleagues to carry out the final steps. Still, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was something personal at stake here. John wasn't just a neighbor to him anymore. He was a symbol of something larger, a force that had sought to undermine James's life, his peace, his safety. To let him walk away now would mean losing the moral high ground. It would mean letting John win. The decision was made. James contacted the local police, providing them with the detailed evidence that had been carefully collected over the past several weeks. Together with Robert's team, they pieced together a case against John, a case that, when presented, would leave no room for denial. There was no turning back now. James couldn't help but feel a deep sense of finality as the police prepared to move in. This was it. The moment when John's reign of terror would come crashing down. The truth would be revealed, and John would face the consequences of his actions. That afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, James stood outside his home looking across the street at John's house. His heart was pounding. He wasn't sure if he was more nervous or relieved. Either way, he knew there was no turning back. He had made the decision to stand up to make a stand for justice. And now it was happening. As if on cue, there was movement across the street. James watched as John stepped out of his front door, his face shadowed by the porch light. He was carrying a small, nondescript bag, but something in his posture told James that this was not an innocent trip to the store. James took a step forward instinctively. His pulse quickened. He had to know. He had to see it for himself. The sound of an engine revving broke the silence. It wasn't John's car. It was another vehicle, one that James hadn't recognized. The car came to a screeching halt in front of John's house. Two figures emerged, moving with practiced speed and precision. James didn't hesitate. He darted behind a row of bushes, out of sight, but still close enough to hear. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to Robert. He's moving forward with something. I don't know what it is yet, but it's happening. Get ready. The figures approached the door and John stepped aside to let them in. A moment later, James could see the flicker of movement through the blinds as the door opened, then closed behind them. His heart raced. This was it. A few minutes passed, but they felt like an eternity. James's mind raced as he tried to piece together what was going on. Was this a deal of some sort? Was John finally going too far? Just then, the front door opened again, and John stepped out, followed by the two strangers. The car engine revved again, but this time James noticed something that made his blood run cold. John was holding a package. It wasn't large, but it was wrapped in plain brown paper. It looked inconspicuous, but James had seen enough to know that things like that didn't just happen by accident. James's gut told him that this wasn't a normal transaction. He couldn't let it pass. Whatever was in that package could change everything. Without thinking, James pulled out his phone again and called Robert. "Get to my place now," James said, his voice tense. "John's making a move. I don't know what it is, but it's something dangerous. He's got a package. I think he's going to do something." "I'm on my way," Robert replied, already sounding like he was in motion. James stayed hidden, watching as John and the two strangers climbed into the car. His fingers clenched around his phone as the car sped off down the street. Without hesitation, he started walking briskly toward his front door. It wasn't over, not yet. But this time he wasn't going to wait around to find out what John was up to. This time he would act. The trial was over, but the reverberations of what had happened still echoed through the quiet streets of the suburban neighborhood. James stood in his modest living room watching the sun begin to set over the horizon, casting long shadows on the walls of his new home. A sense of finality had settled over him in the days that followed the trial. The storm had passed, and life, as it often does after a major conflict, began to find its rhythm again. John was gone from the neighborhood. After the trial, with the overwhelming evidence against him, the once proud man who had terrorized James for months now found himself a mere shadow of his former self. The whispers about him had died down quickly, as whispers often do when a scandal loses its novelty. It was almost as if he had never existed at all, but James knew better. The past year had left scars on both of them, some visible, others buried too deep to be seen. James took a slow breath and looked out the window, the cool evening air filling his lungs. He hadn't expected the weight of the victory to feel so heavy. The relief that had come with the knowledge that John's actions had been exposed and he would be held accountable was real, but there was something about it that didn't sit right. What had he really gained from all this? His peace? His dignity? Or just a small sense of justice in a world that was far too complex to ever be fully understood? He shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside. Justice had been served, at least in the legal sense, but there was more to it than that, wasn't there? What had it all meant for him, for his life? James knew that his decision to remain hidden, to play the role of the quiet neighbor rather than the agent he truly was, had cost him. It had cost him parts of himself, his trust in the system, his faith in people. Even after everything, he still couldn't bring himself to completely shake the fear, the shadow of those days when John had been lurking, watching, judging him. The realization that even with all the right actions, all the proof, all the support, there was always the possibility that a single person, one malicious person, could upend everything. But that was the reality he lived in. People like John didn't care about fairness. They didn't care about truth. They cared about power and control, and when they were denied that, they resorted to whatever means they thought would restore their dominance. Still, James could not let himself linger in the darkness of those thoughts. He had a life to rebuild. He had a future ahead of him, one he was determined to shape on his own terms. For too long, he had been on the defensive. It was time to live for himself, to move forward, to embrace the life he had wanted to have when he first stepped into this neighborhood, when he had hoped to escape his past and build something different. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. James glanced at the screen. It was Robert. "James," Robert's voice came through, warm but tinged with something else. Concern? Or perhaps it was just the lingering tension of everything they had gone through. "How are you doing?" "I'm good," James said, trying to keep the weight of his own emotions out of his voice. "Just reflecting, I guess." "I get that," Robert said. "I just wanted to check in. It's been a few weeks since everything wrapped up. You know, after all the legal stuff, we still have to deal with the aftermath." James nodded, even though Robert couldn't see him. "Yeah, I'm thinking about what's next, about my next steps." "Well, I'm here as always," Robert said. "You know, you did more than just fight for yourself. You stood up for something bigger than you. It's not easy, and it never ends the way you expect. But you've done something a lot of people wouldn't have had the courage to do." James smiled slightly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I wasn't thinking about courage when I did it. I was just..." doing what had to be done. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Robert was likely reflecting too. After all, he had been with James throughout the investigation, the trial, and all the behind-the-scenes work that had made it possible. "You know, John's gone," Robert said softly, "but don't let the weight of his hatred stay with you. It's not worth it." "I'm trying," James replied, "but it's harder than I thought." "I know," Robert said, "but you've already made it through. You'll keep moving forward. You have a future, James. You don't need to carry that old weight anymore. It's done." The words hung in the air for a moment, and James let them settle in. There was truth in what Robert was saying. The past had shaped him, but it didn't have to define him. "I'm going to take a break. I've been meaning to get away for a while," James said, the idea forming as he spoke. "Maybe take a trip, somewhere new, clear my head. I've spent so much time here, in this neighborhood, in this life. Maybe it's time for something different." "That sounds like a good idea," Robert agreed. "You've earned it." As James ended the call, he set the phone down on the table and stood up, walking toward the window again. The sky had turned darker now, the first stars beginning to appear in the vast expanse above. He hadn't realized until now just how much he had been holding on to, how tightly he had gripped onto the past, the anger, the fear, the need for resolution. But now, in the quiet stillness of the evening, he realized that the story of his life wasn't going to be defined by the pain he had endured. It was going to be defined by the choices he made moving forward. He could choose to let go. He could choose peace. He could choose to let the past stay where it belonged, behind him. Turning away from the window, James picked up his jacket and walked toward the door. He had taken the first step in reclaiming his life. Now it was time to take the next. As he stepped out into the cool night air, James didn't know exactly where he was headed, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to find out. And with that, the door closed behind him. The neighborhood that had been the site of his struggle, the place where his fight for justice had unfolded, now felt like a distant memory. The future, however, was wide open, and for the first time in a long time, James felt free. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to stay updated with all our latest content. If you found this video thought-provoking, feel free to share it with your friends and spread the conversation. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from?